Michael Carter slammed the front door so hard the windows rattled, and then stood there, breathing like a man who had just outrun something he couldn't name. His hands were shaking. Not from anger, from the one thing he'd spent 3 years running from. Hope. She had said 4 words that broke something open inside him, and he didn't know whether to thank her or tell her to leave before she figured out the truth about who he really was. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The oranges hit the concrete one by one. That was the thing Michael Carter would remember for years. Not the embarrassment, not the cold November air biting through his flannel shirt, not even the look on his neighbor's face in that first, unguarded second. He would remember the sound. 6 navel oranges striking wet pavement in quick, rolling succession, like the world itself was doing a slow drum roll. For a moment, it had quietly arranged without his permission. He had been standing on his front porch, juggling 2 paper grocery bags and his phone. A call from his daughter Emma's school that had distracted him at exactly the wrong moment, when the bottom of the left bag gave out. Just surrendered. 3 years of holding everything together, and it was a wet grocery bag that finally illustrated the point. Shoot! He said it quietly. He always said things quietly now. There had been a version of Michael Carter who was loud, who laughed at full volume, who argued with passion, who filled up a room without noticing. That man had been married. That man had believed in permanence. This version of Michael said things quietly, because quiet things didn't echo back at you in an empty house. And he crouched down and started gathering the oranges from the wet porch steps. And he was so focused on not losing the second bag too, that he didn't hear footsteps crossing the yard next door. He didn't hear the gate between their properties swing open. He didn't notice anything at all until a hand, steady, unhurried, reached past him and picked up 2 oranges from the bottom step. "You've got them rolling toward the sidewalk," she said. Matter of fact. No mockery in it. He looked up. Claire Navarro was standing 3 feet away from him, holding his oranges like it was the most natural thing in the world, wearing a canvas jacket over a paint-stained gray shirt, her dark hair pulled back in the kind of way that suggested she hadn't thought about it twice. She had moved in 6 weeks ago. The house to his left, the one that had sat empty for 8 months after old Gerald Whitmore passed. Michael had waved at her twice from a distance. That was the extent of their relationship. "Thank you," he said, and stood up too fast, which made the second bag shift dangerously. He grabbed it with both hands. "Sorry, school was calling. I wasn't—" "You don't have to explain." She handed him the 2 oranges, and their fingers didn't quite touch, but almost. "Is everything okay? With the school?" Emma forgot her permission slip. 3rd time this month. He exhaled. "It's fine. I have to fax something from 1987 apparently, because her school is the last place on Earth without email capabilities." Claire almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "How old is Emma?" 9. He shifted the surviving bag to his left arm. "She's 9, and already she has the organizational habits of a very sweet tornado." This time, Claire did smile, and it was the kind of smile that rearranged something in the air around her. Not a performance, just real. "I have a fax app on my phone," she said, "if that helps." Michael blinked. "You, seriously?" "My mother is 73, and her doctor's office still requires them. I learned out of necessity." He stood there for a moment with 6 oranges cradled against his chest, looking at the woman who had appeared from nowhere to rescue his produce and offer him a solution to a problem that had been making him feel like a failure for the last 20 minutes. Something in his chest did a complicated thing he didn't have a name for. "That would actually help a lot," he said, "if you're sure you don't mind." "I'm standing in your front yard holding your oranges," Claire said. "I think we're past minding." They sat on his porch steps. Not inside, because Michael had learned that inviting someone inside your house was a different kind of thing, a thing with weight. and she walked him through the app while he forwarded the permission slip from his email. It took 6 minutes. 6 minutes to solve a problem he'd been catastrophizing for 40. "Done," she said, handing his phone back. "I owe you." He meant it. "Buy me a cup of coffee sometime." He looked at her. She was looking at the oak tree that grew almost exactly on the property line between their yards. A massive, ancient thing that Gerald had told him was over 100 years old. Its roots had buckled the sidewalk in 2 places. "That tree is going to be someone's problem eventually," Michael said. "That tree is going." "Probably yours," Claire said. "The roots are favoring your side." "Fantastic." She stood, brushed off the back of her jacket. "I'm Claire, by the way. We've done the across the yard wave, but not the actual names." "Michael. And I know. You're Claire Navarro. Gerald's daughter told me when you were moving in. She wanted me to keep an eye on things." He paused. "That probably sounds neighborly," Claire said. "I was going to say vaguely surveillance adjacent." She looked at him for a moment. Actually looked at him, the way people rarely did anymore. And then she said, "I'll see you around, Michael," and walked back through the gate. He watched her go. He didn't mean to. He was looking at the tree, he told himself. He was absolutely looking at her. The thing about grief that nobody warned you about, and Michael had read the books, or started them, was that it didn't always look like grief. Sometimes it looked like routine. Wake up. Make Emma's lunch. Drive her to school. Go to the hardware store where he'd worked for 11 years, where he knew every aisle, every regular customer, every creak in the old wood floor. Come home. Make dinner. Help with homework. Tuck her in. Sit in the kitchen with the television on in the other room for noise. Bleh. It looked like a life. It had the shape of a life. But Michael knew the difference between a life and the performance of one, because he had been performing for 3 years. Rebecca had left on a Tuesday. He remembered that detail with strange precision. Not the argument. They'd had variations of the same argument for 2 years by then. But the Tuesdayness of it. The ordinary weekday quality. She had packed what she needed while Emma was at school, and when Michael came home, the note was on the kitchen table and half the closet was empty, and he had stood there for so long that he didn't notice when the afternoon light shifted to evening. Emma had cried for 3 weeks. Michael had not cried at all, because someone had to hold the structure together, and he had decided, without being asked, that that someone was him. He had told himself, "This is temporary. She'll come back. Or she won't. Either way, you survive it. Men like you survive things. It's what you do. Men like you." He had thought that phrase so many times it had grooved itself into him like a record skip. Men like you don't complain. Men like you don't ask for help. Men like you certainly don't stand on their porch at 44 years old getting emotional because a neighbor fixed a fax situation. He was fine. He was absolutely, completely fine. The second time he really talked to Claire was 3 weeks later, and it started with a lie. Hers, not his. He was in the backyard on a Saturday afternoon, trying to fix the latch on the gate, the same gate she had used, when she appeared on her side of the fence and said, "I don't suppose you know anything about water pressure." Michael looked up. "Some. Why?" "My kitchen faucet has been doing something." She paused. "I don't know the technical term. Complaining, maybe." He almost laughed. "Complaining how? Like it's personally offended every time I turn it on. There's this shuddering. It didn't do it when I moved in." He put down his screwdriver. "Could be the pressure regulator. Could be air in the line. Can I take a look?" "If you want. I don't want to take up your Saturday." "Emma's at her mom's this weekend," he said, and he said it the way he always said it. Clean, informational, no weight to it. He had practiced the no-weight version. "I'm not doing anything that matters." Claire looked at him when he said that matters, and he saw something flicker across her face. Not pity, which he would have hated, but something more careful than that. Recognition, maybe. "Come over," she said. Her kitchen was clean in the way that said someone had recently made an effort, but not obsessively so. There were books stacked on the small table by the window. A coffee mug with a drawing on it that looked like Emma's age group's work. Though he'd find out later, it was from a nephew. The faucet was indeed making a sound that was less shudder and more complaint. A low vibration on full blast. "Pressure regulator," he said after 30 seconds. "Almost definitely. It's a fix, but it's not a today fix. You'd need the part. So it's not going to explode. Not today. Then I'll take that as a win." She was already moving to the coffee maker. "Coffee? Since you came all the way next door." He almost said I should get back. The reflex was immediate. Decline, retreat, maintain distance. Avoid the thing that felt like it might be the beginning of something. Because beginnings were also the beginnings of endings, and Michael Carter had been through enough endings. "Sure," he said. He sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours. They talked about Gerald Whitmore, and the history of the neighborhood, and Emma's permission slip chaos, and the hardware store where Michael had worked so long the owner had started leaving the opening to him 3 mornings a week. They talked about Claire's work. She was a medical illustrator, which he had never known was a profession, and she explained it with the patient clarity of someone who was used to the question. They talked about the oak tree and whose problem it was eventually going to be. They didn't talk about Rebecca. They didn't talk about whatever had pulled Claire to this quiet neighborhood from wherever she'd been before. There was an unspoken agreement that certain rooms were not yet open. But 2 hours. He had not sat in someone's kitchen and talked for 2 hours in longer than he could immediately calculate. When he stood to leave, she handed him a book from the stack on her table. "You mentioned you'd been trying to read more," she said. "This one's worth the time." He looked at the cover. A Man Called Ove. He'd heard of it. "There's a note inside," she said. "Don't read it until you're home." He walked next door carrying a novel with a note inside it, and he did not open it until he was sitting at his own kitchen table, alone in his quiet house. And when he did, it said only, "The guy gets it wrong a lot. Still worth knowing." See. Michael sat with that for a long time. He couldn't have said why it hit him the way it did. Something about still worth knowing. The way it was phrased. Not still worth reading, worth knowing. He read the book in 4 days. He didn't have 4 free days. He made them, reading in the car before work. Reading in the lunch hour he usually spent organizing the stockroom. Reading until 12:30 in the morning twice, which he hadn't done since his early 30s. He did not immediately say anything to Claire about it. He wasn't ready to examine why. It was his daughter who noticed first, which should not have surprised him, because Emma noticed everything. "You seem different," she said one Sunday morning, eating cereal across from him at the kitchen table. Michael looked up from his coffee. "Different how?" Emma tilted her head in that way she had, a mannerism so precisely Rebecca's that it sometimes made his chest seize, and said, "Like you got better at paying attention, but to stuff that isn't work or me." That's very philosophical for 8 a.m. Mrs. Kaplan says I have a gift for observation. Mrs. Kaplan is not wrong. Emma went back to her cereal, then said without looking up, "Is it the neighbor? The one with the paint on her jacket?" Michael put his mug down. We're just neighbors, Em." "Okay," Emma said, in exactly the tone that meant I don't believe you, but I'm choosing this hill not to die on. She was 9. She was going to be devastating at 16. "We've had coffee twice," Michael said, hearing himself, hating the defensive tone. "She helped me with the fax thing." "I know. You mentioned the fax thing." Emma looked up. "I'm not saying it's bad, Dad. I'm just saying you seem like you're paying attention again." She paused. "I like it." Michael looked at his daughter. At this small, perceptive, occasionally terrifying person he had somehow gotten the privilege of raising, and felt something loosen in him like a knot that had been pulled too tight for too long. "Eat your cereal," he said. She ate her cereal. She was smiling. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself this with great discipline for 6 more weeks while he and Claire developed the kind of slow, unannounced rhythm that felt less like the beginning of something and more like the resumption of something that had somehow been paused. Coffee on Saturday mornings, usually her porch or his. A wave that had evolved into a real conversation through the fence. Most evenings he got home before dark. He fixed the pressure regulator in her kitchen, got the part from the store, charged her nothing, and when she tried to pay him, he said, "Consider it the return on the fax app." She left a second book, then a third. He started leaving her the good tomatoes from the back of the garden he'd barely been maintaining. Just leaving them on the fence post with a paper bag and no note. Because the books had notes, and the tomatoes had no notes, and somehow that balance felt right. He was not ready to examine any of this. And then, on a Thursday evening in late November, the sky doing that thing it did in November, going dark at 4:30 like someone had pulled a curtain. He was standing on his front porch with a bag of groceries and his phone, and the school was calling, and the bottom of the bag gave out. The oranges hit the concrete. Claire came through the gate. Meow. And Michael, looking at her in the dying light, holding his escaped produce like it was nothing. Like she had always done this, said without thinking. Said it lightly, like a joke, the way he covered everything that scared him with the armor of a joke. "You're too good for me, Claire." He expected her to laugh. He expected the social grace of a laugh that meant don't be silly and moved them safely past the moment. She didn't laugh. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had that first day, and the silence stretched 1 second, 2 seconds, long enough that he felt it in his sternum, and then she said, "That's why I chose you." Michael stood completely still. The word chose hung in the cold November air between them. He wanted to say something. He wanted to deflect, to joke, to run the play he'd been running for 3 years. The one where he moved first and fast away from anything that felt too much like mattering. Instead, he stood there with his oranges, and for the first time in a very long time, Michael Carter didn't say a word. Because for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know how to run from something that had already found him. He didn't sleep that night, not really. He lay in the dark and replayed 4 words until they stopped being words and started being something else entirely. A question he had no idea how to answer, from a woman he was nowhere near ready to understand. He didn't sleep that night. He tried. He went through the motions, turned off the light, pulled the blanket up, stared at the ceiling like it owed him something. But every time he got close to sleep, those 4 words came back. Not loudly. Quietly, the way the most dangerous things always arrived. "That's why I chose you." Chose. Past tense. Like a decision already made. Like she had sat down somewhere, weighed the options, and arrived at him. Michael Carter, hardware store manager, single father. Man with a half-dead garden and a pressure regulator he'd replaced out of guilt, and a shelf full of books he'd started reading again because of a woman he was nowhere near ready to admit he was reading them because of. He rolled onto his side. The clock said 2:14 a.m. He thought about saying something to her in the morning. He rehearsed it 3 different ways, and every version sounded either too much or not enough. And by the time the clock said 3:47, he had decided that the smartest thing to do was let it go. She had said a thing. People said things. It didn't have to mean what it felt like it meant. He finally slept at 4:20. Emma woke him at 6:15 for school, and he made her eggs, and he drove her, and he went to work. He did not think about Claire every 20 minutes. He absolutely did not do that. He did it every 15. By Thursday of the following week, their Saturday morning coffee had come and gone. At her porch, the way it sometimes was, the 2 of them with their mugs, and the oak tree dropping its last November leaves. And neither of them had said anything about the oranges. Neither of them had referenced the moment on the porch at all. On the surface, everything was exactly the same. The wave through the fence. The occasional exchange about Emma's week or Claire's current illustration project. The bag of tomatoes he'd left Monday, even though it was late in the season and the tomatoes were barely worth leaving. But something had changed in the air between them, and Michael knew it, and he was nearly certain she knew it, and neither of them was moving toward it or away from it. And that stillness had its own particular tension, the kind that built quietly in the background of ordinary days until it had enough mass to pull things toward it. Emma noticed. Of course Emma noticed. "You've been weird this week," she announced at dinner on Friday, stabbing a piece of chicken with more precision than the task required. Michael kept his eyes on his plate. "I'm not weird. You made my lunch 3 days in a row." "I always make your lunch. You made it 3 days in a row, and you put a note in it every time." She paused. "You haven't done the note thing since—" She didn't finish that sentence. She was 9, and she was perceptive, and she knew which sentences to finish and which ones to leave alone. "You seem like you're thinking about something." He looked up. "I'm always thinking about something." "Something good this time." She held his gaze. "Is it Claire?" He opened his mouth. "Don't say you're just neighbors," Emma said. "You say that every time, and every time it sounds more like a lie." Michael put his fork down. His 9-year-old daughter was watching him with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world, and he felt, not for the first time, that Emma had arrived in this life with a wisdom that had nothing to do with him. "She said something to me last week," he said carefully, "and I'm still figuring out what to do with it." "What did she say?" He hesitated. "Something that was generous about me." Emma processed this. "And that scared you?" It wasn't a question. Michael looked at his daughter, this small person who had watched him hold himself together with both hands for 3 years, and he said, "Yeah, a little bit." Emma picked her fork back up. "That's silly," she said, but not unkindly. "She's nice, and she helped with the fax thing." "The fax thing was 8 weeks ago, and you still bring it up," Emma said, "which means it mattered." He had no answer to that. He ate his chicken. Emma ate hers. And the house was quiet around them, in the way it always was. That particular quiet that was just the two of them taking up as much space as two people could, which was never quite enough for a house this size. That night, after Emma was in bed, Michael sat in the kitchen and opened the 3rd book Claire had left him, the one he hadn't started yet. He turned to the first page. There was a note on the inside front cover, the same way there'd been a note in the first one, and he'd never told her he'd read all 3 notes multiple times, each one. This one said, "Don't overthink the good things." C. He stared at that for a long time, and then he closed the book, got up, and did something he hadn't done since Rebecca. Since before Rebecca. Since some version of himself he'd almost forgotten. He picked up his phone and typed a message. "I finished the 2nd book. The ending got me." He stared at it for 30 seconds, then hit send before he could think himself out of it. Her response came in less than 2 minutes. "Which part?" "The part where he finally lets someone in and acts like it's surrender, when it isn't." A pause, longer this time, 40 seconds maybe. He watched the screen. "What is it then?" she wrote. "I don't know yet," he typed. "I'm still figuring that out." Another pause, then, "Fair enough. Good night, Michael." "Good night." He put his phone down. He was smiling. He caught himself doing it and didn't stop. He slept fine that night. He slept better than he had in 3 years. The Saturday morning after that, Claire came to his porch instead of hers. She brought the coffee, which she had never done before, 2 paper cups from the cafe on the corner, the good one, not the gas station. And she knocked on his front door like a person who had thought about it and decided to move an inch in a direction. He opened the door. She held out a cup. "I figured it was my turn." He stepped aside. She came in, which was also new. She had not been inside his house yet, only in the kitchen doorway the day of the fax. And she looked around without comment, the way a person did when they were taking an inventory that they weren't going to share. They sat at the kitchen table. Emma was at Rebecca's for the weekend. The house had its weekend alone with himself quality, which normally felt like a reminder of everything missing. But today felt different with another person in it. "I want to say something," Claire said, both hands around her cup. "And I want you to let me finish before you say anything." Michael looked at her. "Okay, what I said last week. The chose you thing." She met his eyes. "I know you've been turning it over. I could tell all week, even without seeing you much. You have a very transparent thinking face. That's either a compliment or a warning." "Michael." She said his name with enough weight that he stopped. "I'm not going to apologize for saying it. I said it because it's true, and I knew it was true when I said it, which is not how I usually operate, so that should tell you something." She exhaled. "But I also need you to understand that I'm not someone who shows up in your yard and performs feelings for an audience. I don't do that. I've been through enough to know that performance gets everyone nowhere. What have you been through?" He didn't plan to ask it. It came out on its own. She looked at him. For a moment he thought she'd deflect. She was good at the surface-level redirect. He had noticed that over the past 2 months, had cataloged it the way you cataloged things about people you were paying attention to. But she didn't. "A marriage," she said. "And then the end of one. And then a few years of thinking I was better off alone, which I think I was for a while. And then realizing that better off alone can become a habit that doesn't know when to stop." The parallel landed between them without either of them naming it. "How long ago?" he asked. 4 years, no kids. Different kind of hard." She turned the cup in her hands. "He was a good man in a lot of ways. We wanted different versions of the future, and neither of us knew how to say that until it was too late to say it gently." "I know that territory," Michael said. "I know you do." Silence. But the comfortable kind. The kind that wasn't asking to be filled. "I'm scared," he said, and he said it looking at the table, not at her, because there was a specific kind of honesty that was easier sideways. "Not of you, of—" He stopped. Tried again. "Rebecca left, and I spent a long time thinking it was because I wasn't enough. Not interesting enough, not ambitious enough, not whatever the thing was she needed that I couldn't figure out how to be. And I rebuilt myself into something functional, something that works. I can do the job and raise the kid and keep the lights on and be fine." He finally looked up. "But fine it doesn't account for this." "For what?" "For someone sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning and making me feel like I want more than fine." The words landed. He heard them himself, as if someone else had said them. He was 44 years old, and he had not said anything like that out loud in 3 years, and maybe longer. Claire looked at him across the table and didn't rush to fill the space. She just let him have the words back, let them belong to him, which was a specific and rare thing to give someone. Then she said quietly, "I didn't choose you because I felt sorry for you, Michael." He felt that in his chest. "I know." "Do you?" He hesitated. "Sometimes," she nodded. "Then I'll say it once and I won't repeat it 100 times. Because you're not a man who needs 100 repetitions, you just need one that lands. I sat in my kitchen on a Thursday night 8 weeks ago, and I looked at the text you sent me about the fax, the dumb, ordinary text about the fax. And I realized I had been looking forward to getting it all day without knowing I was looking forward to it. That was the thing. That was the chose." She set her cup down. Not a lightning bolt, not a movie moment, just, "Oh. That's the person I've been paying attention to, and then I made a decision." Michael sat with that. He thought about lightning bolts. He'd had one with Rebecca 20 years ago, the whole collision and fireworks version of falling for someone, the kind that burned bright and hot and left marks when it was done. He had told himself ever since that the absence of that feeling was the absence of love. That if it wasn't thunder, it wasn't real. He had never considered that the real thing might sound like 6 oranges hitting wet concrete and a neighbor coming through the gate. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he said. "Whatever this is, I've been alone long enough that I've forgotten the fluency of it, the shared life vocabulary." "I haven't been alone as long," Claire said, "and I've still forgotten half of it. That's not a disqualification." "What if I get it wrong?" "You will," she said without hesitation. "I will too. That's not the question." He looked at her. "What is?" "Whether you want to try." The word hung there. Try. Such a small, unspectacular word for such a terrifying thing. He thought about Emma, at her mother's this weekend, who had told him he seemed like he was paying attention again and looked genuinely happy about it. He thought about a note in a book that said, "Don't overthink the good things." He thought about the way 2 hours in Claire's kitchen had felt longer and shorter at the same time. The way that only happened when you were with someone whose company your nervous system had quietly already decided to trust. "Yeah," he said, "I want to try." Claire picked her cup back up. She didn't smile dramatically. She didn't make it a moment. She just nodded. Once, like a woman who had made a decision and was at peace with it. "Okay," she said. "Then try." What followed was not a romance in the Hollywood sense. There were no candle-lit dinners, no declarations, no scene where someone runs to catch someone else at an airport. What there was this, a slow, incremental, daily choosing. Coffee on Saturday that sometimes extended to lunch. Emma meeting Claire properly, finally, one Sunday afternoon when Michael had run out of reasons to keep the two halves of his life carefully separated. Emma had been quiet for the first 20 minutes, assessing, in that way of hers, and then had asked Claire 6 rapid-fire questions about medical illustration that Claire had answered with the patience of someone who genuinely liked the company of curious 9-year-olds. After Claire left that afternoon, Emma said, "I like her. She doesn't talk down to me." "She's like that with everyone," Michael said. "I know," Emma said. "That's how you can tell." Mao. The weeks moved. November became December, and December had its particular weight. The first winter holidays after a divorce never got easier. They just got different. And Michael had learned to navigate Emma's Christmas with the same careful honesty he applied to everything else where her feelings were involved. She spent Christmas Eve with Rebecca and Christmas morning with him, and he always made the morning count. This year, he did something he hadn't planned to do. 3 days before Christmas, he knocked on Claire's door and asked if she wanted to be there. Not as a statement of anything, he said carefully. Just if she'd like to be there, if it wasn't too much, if she didn't have family plans. She looked at him in the doorway. "I was going to drive to my sister's in the afternoon, but the morning—" She paused. "Yes, I'd like that." And Christmas morning, Claire sat at his kitchen table while Emma opened 3 presents with the focused intensity she brought to all things that mattered, and Michael made pancakes, and the radio played something old and familiar in the background, and nobody said anything about what this was or wasn't. They just let it be what it was. A morning, a kitchen. 3 people who had all, for different reasons, spent enough time alone to know what it meant not to be. When Emma held up a book she'd unwrapped and said, "Dad, Claire said this one was good," Michael looked at Claire. She was watching Emma with an expression he hadn't seen her wear before. Open, unguarded. The kind of face people only make when they think no one is looking. He didn't say anything. He just made a note of it, the way he was making a note of all of it. The way a man does when he's starting to understand that he's in the middle of something worth remembering. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, in the uncomplicated ease of that December morning, was that January was coming. And January was going to bring Rebecca. And Rebecca was going to walk through his front door carrying the weight of everything he thought he'd already worked out. And she was going to say things that would land exactly where she knew they would land, in the places Michael Carter had never fully patched over. And for 10 days after that, Claire's porch light would go on every evening, and Michael would see it from his window and do nothing. He would not knock. He would not text. He would not go through the gate. He would sit in his kitchen with the book she'd left him, and the silence of a man who had just remembered, in the worst possible way, why he'd decided 3 years ago that he wasn't enough for anyone. Rebecca showed up on a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. Michael had been at the store until 6, and he came home to find her car parked in front of his house. The silver Accord she'd driven away in 3 years ago. The same one, which meant she hadn't traded it in, which meant some part of him knew immediately that she hadn't changed as much as he'd told himself she probably had. People who were done with their old lives got new cars. People who were still circling the old ones kept the same one. He sat in his truck for 11 seconds before getting out. He counted. She was standing on his porch, and when she turned and saw him walking up the path, she did the thing she had always done when she wanted something. She softened her whole face, deliberately, the way an actor hits a mark. Michael had spent 16 years learning that face. He knew exactly what it meant and what it was about to cost him. "Hey," she said. "Rebecca." He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Emma's at school." "I know. I'm not here for Emma." She had a tote bag over one shoulder. "There's a box. From the hall closet. My mother's things. I should have taken it when I left and I didn't, and I need it now." "You could have texted." "I didn't think it would be a big deal." She paused. "Is it a big deal?" He looked at her for a moment. Really looked, the way he'd stopped doing somewhere in the last year of their marriage because looking too closely had only hurt. And then he pushed past her and unlocked the door. "Come in. I'll find the box." He found it in 10 minutes. It was exactly where she said it was, which meant she had known precisely where it was and could have told him that, and he could have shipped it to her, but here they were. He carried it out to the living room and set it on the coffee table, and she stood there looking around the house with the particular expression of someone recalibrating a memory against a reality. "You painted," she said. "2 years ago. It looks good." She walked toward the hallway, slow, like she was taking inventory. "Emma's drawing's on the refrigerator. She's gotten better." "She's 9. Kids tend to improve." Rebecca turned. She was looking past him, toward the kitchen, and something shifted in her face. The softness dropped for just a second, replaced by something sharper, more alert. "You have 2 coffee cups on the counter." Michael said nothing. "Different sizes," she said. "Yeah." He still said nothing, because he didn't owe her an account of his countertops, but his silence was its own answer, and she was too smart not to read it. "The neighbor," she said. Not a question. "Gerald's daughter mentioned someone moved in next door. Young woman." "She's 41, Michael said. "And it's not your business." "No." Rebecca looked at him directly. "No, you're right, it isn't." She reached down and picked up the tote bag, folded her hands over the box. Then she said quieter, "Is she good to Emma?" The question surprised him, the genuine-sounding quality of it. "Yes." "Good." She nodded once. Then, "Are you happy, Michael?" He crossed his arms. "Why are you asking me that?" "Because I'm allowed to still care about whether you're okay. Even if I'm not the one." She stopped, started again. "I know what I did. I know how I left. And I know that I told myself for a long time that you'd be fine, because you're always fine. You're Michael. Michael is always fine. And I think I used that to—" She exhaled. "I used that to make it easier for me." The room was very quiet. "Rebecca." He said her name the way he said the hard things, evenly, without theater. "Why are you actually here?" She looked at him. Something moved across her face that might have been the closest thing to honest he'd seen from her in years. "I don't know," she said. And then, smaller, "I think I wanted to see if you'd moved on." The air went out of the room. He didn't respond to that. He walked to the door and held it open. She picked up the box, adjusted the tote, and walked past him without another word. At the bottom of the porch steps she stopped, her back to him. "She's lucky," Rebecca said. "Whoever she is." Michael closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a long time after the sound of her car faded. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been cleaner, easier to process. What he felt was something older and messier. The specific disorientation of having someone walk back through a door you'd spent 3 years convincing yourself was permanently closed. She hadn't said anything terrible. She hadn't attacked him or undermined him or threatened anything. She had shown up, looked around, and left. But she had said one thing that was still sitting in him like a splinter he couldn't locate. "I think I used that to make it easier for me." Used what? His stability? His reliability? His capacity to absorb damage and keep functioning? The very qualities he had told himself were his strengths were apparently also the qualities that had made it easy for someone to leave him, because they knew he'd survive it. He was the man you left because he'd be fine. He was always fine. By the time Emma came home from school, Michael had assembled a version of himself that functioned through homework, help and dinner and bedtime without revealing anything. He was good at assembly. He'd had practice. It was after 9 o'clock when he finally sat in the kitchen alone, and that was when he heard it. Claire's back door. The specific sound of it that he had cataloged over the past months without meaning to. He knew the sound of her door. He knew the sound of her porch step, the one that creaked on the left side. He knew the sound of her car in the driveway. He sat at the kitchen table, and he did not get up at it. He told himself he was tired. He told himself it was late. He told himself a dozen reasonable, functional things that sounded like a man being sensible and were actually a man retreating back into the shape that felt safest. The man who was always fine. The man you could leave. He did not knock on her door that night. He did not text her. He sat in his kitchen, alone, with a book open in front of him that he did not read, and he let the splinter work its way deeper, because some part of him believed, on a level too old and too quiet to argue with directly, that Rebecca's visit had revealed something he should have known already, that he had been fooling himself, that Claire had seen some version of him that wasn't the real one, that the real one was the man Rebecca had packed a bag and walked away from on a Tuesday afternoon without a second look back. Why? He went to bed at 11. On Wednesday, he waved to Claire through the fence at his normal time, on his way to the truck, and she waved back, and he kept walking. On Thursday, he got home after dark, and her porch light was on, and he went inside. On Friday, Emma asked why he'd been quiet all week, and he said he was tired from work, which was not untrue, just not the whole truth. And Emma looked at him the way she looked at him when she knew she was only getting part of the story, but had decided not to push. He did not think about what Rebecca had said. He thought about it constantly. That Saturday came and went with no coffee. He told himself Claire had probably made other plans. She hadn't texted to ask about it. Neither had he. The absence of a text from either direction was doing something to the air between their houses, a pressure building quietly like weather. Sunday was worse. He could feel himself doing it, could feel the withdrawal happening in real time, the way you could sometimes watch yourself make a bad decision and be powerless to stop it, because the part of you making the decision was older than the part that knew better. He had been here before, not with Claire, but with the version of himself that believed, at the cellular level, that being wanted was a misunderstanding that would eventually get corrected. Mom. The splinter from Rebecca's visit had a sentence attached to it, one she hadn't actually said, but that he heard in her voice, in the inventory she'd taken of his house, in the question, "Is she lucky?" And the sentence was, "You are a man, people leave eventually. You are always fine afterward. That is your role in this story." By the following Tuesday, 10 days after Rebecca had stood in his living room, Claire knocked on his door, and he opened it, and her face told him immediately that she had been patient long enough and had decided to stop being patient. "Are you avoiding me?" she said. Not accusing, asking, directly, the way she did everything. Michael held the door. "Come in." "I'd rather you answer the question on the porch." He stepped out, closed the door behind him. The night was cold and clear, and he crossed his arms not against her, but against the temperature, and she stood 2 feet away with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes on him. "Something happened," she said. "A week and a half ago. Something shifted, and I've been watching you from next door go quiet in a way that it feels like shutting down, Michael. It feels like going back behind something." She paused. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice. I noticed." He looked at her. He was so tired. Not physically, the other kind. The kind that came from working against your own bones. "Rebecca came," he said. Claire's expression didn't change, but something in her went still. "When?" "The Tuesday after Christmas. She came to pick up a box." He exhaled. "And she said some things. She wasn't cruel. She's not a cruel person. But she said some things that I have been—" He stopped, tried to find the honest version. "I've been sitting with some things." "What things?"
Yes.
He looked at the porch floor, then back at her. "That I'm the man people leave because they know I'll survive it. That's my role. I hold things together and I'm reliable and I don't fall apart. And that makes me easy to leave." He heard himself saying it, and it sounded, out loud, exactly as broken as it had been sounding in his head for 10 days. "And I started thinking that you'd seen some version of me that wasn't. That was maybe better than the actual thing." But Claire stood very still. "And then I thought," he continued, because he was already in it now, might as well say all of it, "that this, whatever this is, was going to follow the same pattern. That I was going to get invested, and then you were going to realize something that Rebecca realized, and I was going to be standing in this house again, being fine about it, and Emma was going to watch me be fine about it, and I just—" His voice went quiet. "I can't do another round of fine. I don't have another fine left in me." Claire pulled her hands out of her jacket pockets. She took 1 step toward him and then stopped, like she was giving him space to choose whether to close the remaining distance. "Michael," she said, "look at me." He looked. "Rebecca doesn't know you," Claire said. "She knew a version of you inside a marriage that wasn't working for either of you. That's not the whole inventory. She knew me for 16 years. She knew you for 16 years, and she still thought you'd be fine because she needed you to be fine. Those are not the same thing as being seen." Her voice was steady and quiet, and it had that quality it sometimes had of landing without theater, landing just as fact. "You told me in your kitchen on a Saturday morning that you were scared, that you wanted more than fine. That was not a man hiding behind reliability. That was a real person telling the truth, and I heard it." He was quiet. "What did she actually say?" Claire asked. "Not the version you've been running in your head for 10 days? What did she actually say?" He thought about it. The real words, not the amplified ones. "She said she used my capacity to be okay, to make it easier to leave." "That's her guilt talking," Claire said. "She's not wrong about the fact, but she's framing it as your flaw when it's her limitation. There's a difference." She held his gaze. "The same quality that she walked away from is the one that's kept Emma in a stable, loved home for 3 years. The same steadiness you think makes you dispensable is exactly what makes you, Michael, it's what makes you safe to love." Something cracked in his chest. Not broke. Cracked. The specific sound of something load-bearing giving just slightly under pressure that was real and present and not something he'd imagined. He put his hand on the door behind him, not to go inside, just to have something solid to hold on to. "I didn't mean to disappear on you," he said. "I know." She said it immediately, no performance of forgiveness, just acknowledgement. "I've been next door. I wasn't going anywhere. You could have knocked sooner." Yes, she said. But you needed the 10 days. He looked at her. How do you know that? Because you're the kind of person who needs to fight the thing in private before you can talk about it out loud. I've been paying attention. A pause. Also, Emma texted me on Sunday. He blinked. Emma texted you. She said, and I'm quoting, "My dad is being a hermit, and I think he needs someone to knock on the door, but he won't knock first." Claire's mouth curved. She has my number from the Christmas morning pancakes. I hope that's okay. Michael stood on his cold front porch, looking at the woman who had waited 10 days and then come to him anyway, whose knock had not been accusation, but navigation, and who had apparently been coordinating with his 9-year-old daughter. And he thought about all the things he didn't deserve that he'd been handed anyway in this one improbable chapter of his life. "It's okay," he said. "Good." She took her hands out of her pockets, and this time she didn't stop walking when she got close. She just stood there, near him, both of them in the cold and the quiet, and she said, "You are not a man people leave because you'll survive it. You are a man who survives things because he has to, for Emma, for himself. And that is a different sentence entirely. Don't let her rewrite it." He nodded. Once. The way a man did when he didn't trust his voice. "Come inside," he said finally. "It's cold." "I was waiting for you to ask," she said. He held the door open. She walked past him into the warmth of the house. The kitchen light was on, and the book she had left him was still on the table, still open to the page he hadn't been reading, and she looked at it when she walked in, but didn't say anything about it. He put the kettle on. She sat at the table, and the house, which had been too quiet for 10 days, filled up again with the sound of two people in the same room, choosing to be there. Which was, Michael was beginning to understand, the whole thing. The entire thing. Not the thunderbolt. Not the fireworks. Just the choosing. Just the staying. What he didn't know yet. What was still coming. Still forming itself out of all the ordinary days that were about to follow, was that the choosing was about to be tested again. Not by Rebecca. Not by his own fear. But by the quieter, more insidious thing. The question of whether a man who had spent 3 years becoming smaller could actually believe, in his bones and not just his better moments, that he was worth the choosing. That answer was still 4 months away, and it was going to come from the most unexpected direction. 4 months. That was how long it took for Michael Carter to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then, not because the fear went away. It didn't. Not entirely. Not the way you could surgically remove a thing that had grown into you over 3 years of being alone. But there was a difference between fear that paralyzed and fear that you just carried with you while you kept moving. And somewhere between January and April, he had crossed that line without marking the exact moment it happened. That was how healing worked, he was learning. Not a ceremony, not a date you could circle on the calendar. Just one morning you realize the wait is different. Still there. Just different. January had been rebuilding. Quiet and deliberate. The way you repaired something structural. Carefully, without rushing, checking the work as you went. He had told Claire, standing in his kitchen with the kettle on, most of what had been running through his head for those 10 days. Not all of it. Some of it was still too interior, too tangled in old wiring to pull out cleanly. But enough. Enough that she understood the shape of it. Enough that the silence between them for those 10 days had a context now instead of just a wait. What? She hadn't pushed for the rest. That was one of the things he was cataloging about her. The specific way she understood that people had rooms they opened on their own schedule. She waited at the door. She didn't pick the lock. February came in cold and busy. His store had its annual inventory cycle, which meant 12-hour days, 4 days a week, and a kind of productive exhaustion that was actually good for him. The kind that left no room for the circular thinking that had always been his enemy. Emma had a school project that required a tri-fold board and specific amounts of glue and several trips to the craft store. and they had spent one Sunday evening building it together on the kitchen table, while Claire sat on the counter eating an apple and consulting on the color scheme when asked, which Emma asked about 4 times because Emma had discovered that Claire had opinions about design and respected them. And Michael had watched the two of them argue, gently and with great seriousness, about whether the title letters should be blue or green, and he had thought, this is the thing, not the thunder. This. 2 people who matter to you in the same room on an ordinary Sunday, caring about the same small thing. He hadn't said that out loud. He'd kept it, filed it in the place where he kept the things that were too true to say carelessly. And March brought something he hadn't anticipated. Dan Kowalski, his closest friend since high school, drove in from Columbus for a long weekend, the first time they'd been in the same city in almost 2 years. Dan was the kind of friend who told you the truth without editorializing, the kind who had known you long enough to have no patience for the performance version of how you were doing. They were at the kitchen table with beers on Friday night, Emma already asleep, and Dan had been there 4 hours total when he said, without looking up from the label he was peeling, "So what's her name?" Michael looked at him. "Who?" "The person who changed the air in this house." Dan gestured broadly. "It's different in here. You're different. I've known you since we were 19 years old, Mike. Something changed." Michael was quiet for a moment. Then, "Claire. She lives next door." Dan looked up. The expression on his face was not surprise. It was something closer to relief. "Tell me." And Michael told him. Not the abbreviated version he might have given someone he trusted less. The real one. The oranges, the fax app, the books with notes inside them, the Christmas morning with pancakes, Rebecca's visit, the 10 days of silence, the night Claire knocked on his door. Dan listened the way he always had, without interrupting, turning his beer slowly in his hands. When Michael finished, Dan said, "And you're doing the thing." "What thing?" "The thing where you wait for the evidence that you don't deserve it." Dan said it without cruelty, just fact. "I've watched you do it your whole life, Mike. Something good shows up, and you stand next to it, and you wait to find out what the catch is. Rebecca did a number on that. But that thing was there before Rebecca." Michael started to object. Dan held up one hand. "I'm not diagnosing you, I'm just—" "It's the thing. You know what the thing is. The question is whether you're going to keep doing it or try something different." He put his beer down. "Does she know about the waiting?" "We talked about it." "She's still there?" "She's next door." Dan nodded slowly. "Then she already answered the question you've been asking yourself for 3 months." He picked up his beer. "The rest of it's on you." Michael sat with that through the rest of the evening, through Dan's stories from Columbus, through the comfortable rhythm of old friendship that required no performance. And when Dan left Sunday afternoon, he shook Michael's hand on the porch and said, quietly so only Michael could hear, "Stop waiting for the catch, Mike. There might not be one." He watched Dan's car go down the street. He stood on the porch for a moment. Claire's car was in the driveway. He thought about what Dan had said. He thought about the specific quality of stillness he had trained himself into over 3 years. The careful, defended stillness of a man who had decided that the safest posture was readiness for loss. He went inside. He picked up his phone. He texted Claire. "Dan says hi. He also says, 'I'm emotionally stunted,' in the nicest possible way." Her response came in 40 seconds. "Tell Dan I agree, also in the nicest possible way." He left this afternoon. It was good to see him. A pause. Then, "You okay?" He stared at those 2 words. 2 words that on the surface were routine, and underneath were the specific question she had been asking him in different forms since November. Not "how are you functioning," but "how are you actually," the real version. "Getting there," he wrote. "Good," she wrote back. And then, "Getting there is enough." He put his phone down. Dan's voice in his head. "Stop waiting for the catch." He exhaled, long and slow. And then he made a decision that was small in form and enormous in what it cost him. He stopped waiting. Not all at once. You couldn't amputate a reflex all at once. But he made a conscious, daily decision to stop treating his own happiness like a problem that needed auditing. To stop looking at what he and Claire were building for the fault line underneath it. He chose to just be in it. And the April morning that followed, the one that had been 4 months in the making, arrived on a Saturday with no particular drama. He was in the backyard working on the garden he had barely maintained for 3 years, the one that had produced the late tomatoes and otherwise sat in a state of apologetic overgrowth, and he had decided that spring was the moment to actually deal with it. Not out of some symbolic gesture. He just wanted a working garden. He wanted something to grow. Claire had come through the gate. She used it easily now, the way you used a gate between your yard and the yard of someone you trusted. And without asking had started pulling weeds from the bed along the fence, just picked up a pair of gloves from the hook on the shed wall and started. They had worked in silence for 40 minutes, the comfortable kind that had become their native language, and then she said, "Can I tell you something?" He kept working. Always. "I was scared too," she said. "When I told you I chose you, I need you to know that wasn't a calm, confident moment on my end. I was terrified." He stopped, looked at her. She was pulling a weed with specific attention, not looking at him, the way he sometimes said the important things to the kitchen floor. I had done 3 years of being fine with being alone, and I had convinced myself that was a strength, not a habit. And then you were just there, every day, being real, in this exhausting and genuine way, and I fell behind my own defenses before I knew it was happening. She finally looked up. "When I said it, I didn't know if you would run." "I almost did," he said honestly. "I know, I watched you almost do it for 10 days. And you came back anyway." "Of course I came back." She said it like it was obvious, like there was no other option she had ever seriously considered. That's what you do when you've made a decision. He was quiet for a moment, his hands still in the soil. "I've been trying to stop waiting for the thing to fall apart." "How's that going?" He thought about it genuinely. "Better. Some days better than others." She nodded. "That's what I expected." "You expected it?" You're a person who survived something hard by building something very solid inside himself. You don't just dismantle solid things because someone asks nicely. It takes time. She went back to the weeds. "I'm not in a hurry." Whoa. He watched her for a moment, hands in the dirt, methodical, unhurried, completely present. And he thought about the woman Rebecca had probably imagined when she saw 2 different coffee cups on the counter. Some version that was younger or less complicated, or more obviously cinematic. Some version that matched the story of a man moving on in the way that stories were supposed to go. Claire Navarro was not that version. She was better than that version. She was a woman with her own scar tissue and her own defended rooms and her own history of standing in the wreckage of something she had believed in and deciding to be okay anyway. And she had looked at all of that in herself and in him and said, still worth it. Still choosing. He had been waiting for someone to tell him he was worth choosing. He had not understood until this moment, in this backyard in early April, that the person whose job that was, first and before anyone else, had always been him. "I want to say something," he said. She looked up. "I know I'm not. I know this is not a simple thing. Me, Emma, the whole configuration. I know it's a lot to walk toward." "Michael, let me finish." He sat back on his heels. "I spent 3 years telling myself I was protecting Emma by not bringing anyone into our life. But I think part of it was protecting myself. If it's just me and her, then whatever breaks, I can handle it. I know how to handle it. But this?" He gestured between them, the yard, the gate, the oak tree that had been dropping leaves in both their directions since November. "This I don't totally know how to handle. And that terrifies me, and I'm doing it anyway." Claire was very still. "I'm telling you that," he said, "because I want you to know it's not casual for me. Whatever this is, it's not casual." She was quiet for a long moment. He could hear the neighborhood around them. A car down the street, someone's lawnmower 2 houses down, a bird in the oak tree doing something loud and committed. The ordinary sound of an April morning. "It's not casual for me either," she said. "It hasn't been casual since the fax app." He laughed, genuine and sudden and from somewhere undefended. She laughed too, and it broke the moment open into something lighter without losing any of the weight underneath. "The fax app," he repeated. "Romantic origin story," she said. "Tell it at parties." "What?" He shook his head, smiling, and went back to the garden. She went back to the weeds, and they worked, side by side in the April light, without needing to name what they were, or put edges on it, or make it official in any ceremony larger than this. 2 people in a yard, choosing to be there, doing the small and ordinary work of tending something they wanted to grow. It was Emma who detonated everything. Meng. Not maliciously, not even knowingly. Emma, who noticed everything and said the thing other people were carefully not saying, who was 9 years old and had not yet learned the adult skill of strategic silence. She came home from school on a Wednesday in late April. Michael had left work early for a dentist appointment and was home by 3:30, which was unusual. And she came through the front door, dropped her backpack with a crash in the hallway, and called out, "Is Claire here?" "Not right now," Michael said from the kitchen. "She's working." Emma appeared in the doorway. She processed this, then said, with the directness that would one day make her either an exceptional negotiator or someone's difficult HR department, "When are you going to ask her to be your girlfriend?" Michael turned from the sink. "Where did that come from?" "Olivia's dad got remarried, and he said he asked because Olivia told him it was time." Emma dropped into a chair. "I'm telling you it's time." "Emma, I'm just saying." She opened her backpack and pulled out a folder. "She's here all the time. You're different when she's here. Better different, not weird different. And she taught me how to draw hands, which Mrs. Kaplan said was impressive for my age." She opened the folder. "You should ask her." Michael stood in his kitchen being told by his 4th grader to define the relationship, and he felt the absurdity of it and the truth of it in exactly equal measure. "It's complicated," he said, because that was the adult thing to say. Emma gave him a look that was decades older than her face. "It's only complicated because you're making it complicated," she said. "That's what you always do." He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. The same gesture Dan had used, which meant either great minds or Michael Carter had very obvious patterns, and said, "Don't." He closed his mouth. Emma put a worksheet on the table. "Can you help me with fractions?" she said, and the conversation was over. The way Emma ended conversations, she considered concluded. She had said her piece. She was done. Michael sat down across from her and looked at the fractions worksheet and thought about his daughter, who had grown up watching him hold the structure together and had apparently decided that the time had come to hold something else together, something he had been tiptoeing around for 5 months while calling it being careful. He helped with the fractions. He made dinner. He tucked Emma in and said goodnight. Then he stood in the kitchen, alone, and picked up his phone. His heart was doing something he recognized from being 17 years old. That specific, ridiculous, pre-jump adrenaline of being about to do something that mattered. He was 44 years old. He typed, "Emma has informed me that I am overcomplicating things." Claire's response, "She texted me the same thing 10 minutes ago." He stared at that. "She what?" Direct quote, "My dad is going to text you something, and you should say yes." Michael sat down at his kitchen table. His 9-year-old daughter had conducted a bilateral negotiation without his knowledge, and he was sitting in the wake of it with no defense left and a phone in his hand, and nothing between him and the honest thing except the final, small, enormous step of saying it. "She's not wrong," he typed, about overcomplicating it. "No," Claire wrote, "she's not." He took a breath, typed, "I would like to not complicate it anymore, if you're still in." 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of the spring. "I've been in," she wrote, "since the fax app." He put his phone down on the kitchen table and sat in his quiet house and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for 3 years. Not dramatically, not with fireworks, but with the specific, irreplaceable weight of something finding its place. Like a door you'd been trying to close that finally met the frame. Like the last piece of something fitting without being forced. He was still sitting there when his phone buzzed one more time. "Also, Emma wants pancakes Saturday. She's already invited herself." He read it twice. Then he wrote back, "I'll get the good maple syrup." And he did. The good maple syrup was the real kind, the dark amber from the small farm stand on Route 9 that Michael had been buying from for 6 years without ever telling anyone he thought it mattered. He told Claire that Saturday morning, handing her the bottle, and she looked at it and then at him with the expression she wore when he revealed something small that turned out not to be small at all. "You've been buying the real kind the whole time," she said. "Seemed worth it." She set the bottle on the counter. "That's you in one sentence, Michael Carter." He didn't ask her to explain it. He understood what she meant. He had always done the quiet version of caring. The good maple syrup, the tomatoes on the fence post, the books returned with notes folded inside them, the version that didn't announce itself, the version that could be mistaken for nothing by someone not paying attention. Claire was paying attention. Emma ate 3 pancakes and declared them the best she'd ever had, which she said every Saturday now with the consistency of someone establishing a tradition through sheer repetition, and then she disappeared to her room to draw, the way she did when she sensed the adults needed the kitchen to themselves without being told. 9 years old. The instincts of someone twice that. Michael poured more coffee. Claire was leaning against the counter, and the Saturday morning light was the kind that made everything look like it had always been exactly this way, and he had learned by now to let himself have that, to not immediately audit the feeling for what was wrong with it. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. "Okay. And I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." "Those aren't always different things with me. I know. That's why I'm asking." He set his mug down. "Is this enough for you? The pace of it, the configuration, me and Emma and the house and the hardware store and Saturday pancakes. Is this the life you wanted when you moved here? Or is it the life you found and decided to accept?" Claire was quiet for a moment. Not the kind of quiet that meant she was figuring out what to say. The kind that meant she was being precise. "When I moved here," she said, "I wanted quiet. I wanted a place where I could work and not feel like I was behind on something. I wanted neighbors who didn't need things from me." She paused. "What I found was you leaving tomatoes on the fence post with no note, and a 9-year-old who argued with me about color theory, and a man who reads books with actual attention and leaves them better than he found them." She met his eyes. "This isn't the life I accepted, Michael. This is the life I didn't know I was looking for." He stood with that, let it land where it needed to land. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said back. And that was the whole conversation. Not because there wasn't more to say, but because some things, when said right, didn't need additions. Yisi. May arrived, and the garden came back in a way that surprised him. He had put in the work through April, mornings before the store, evenings after Emma was in bed. And by mid-May, there were actual rows of things actually growing, which felt disproportionately significant for a man who had once let the whole plot go to weeds because he couldn't summon the energy to care about something that took effort and returned results slowly. Claire had contributed 6 tomato plants from a nursery run she'd made without telling him, just appeared one afternoon with them in the back of her car and said she'd had a coupon, which he was 90% certain was not true. He planted them in the back row. They were already doing better than his. It was Emma who told Rebecca. Not as a report, not dramatically. It came out, apparently, during a regular Tuesday pickup, when Rebecca had asked how things were at home, and Emma had said, with the cheerful specificity of a child who did not recognize the weight of certain information, that Claire was her dad's girlfriend now and had taught her how to draw hands and made really good coffee. Michael found out on Thursday when Rebecca texted him. Not the long, wounded kind of text he might have dreaded from her 6 months ago. Just, "Emma told me." "I'm glad, Michael. I mean that." He read it 3 times. Then he showed it to Claire, because he was done keeping the halves of his life separated. She read it, handed the phone back. "How does that feel?" "Strange," he said. "And okay." "Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No," he said. "They're not." What he didn't tell Claire, not yet, not that day, was what he had done the night before. He had gone into his bedroom closet, the one that still had the space on the left side where Rebecca's things used to be, and he had reached to the top shelf and taken down the small metal box he had kept there since the divorce was finalized. Inside was a key, his key, not to his house, but to the first apartment he and Rebecca had shared, the one they'd rented 3 months after getting married, the one he had kept because he hadn't known what to do with the ending of something you had believed in completely. He had kept it for 3 years, the way you kept certain objects, not because they were useful, but because letting go of them felt like finally admitting the thing you already knew. He had not been ready to admit it. He stood in his bedroom and turned the key over in his hand and thought about the apartment, the life, the version of himself who had believed that permanent meant permanent, and he felt the grief of it, real and clean and without blame, the way grief was when you had finally stopped being angry at it. And then he walked to the kitchen and put the key in the junk drawer. Not the trash, not yet, but out of the box. Out of the place where he had been keeping it like a verdict. That was Thursday. By Saturday he had moved it to the trash and felt nothing he hadn't expected to feel, which turned out to be very little. It was Dan who called him on it when they talked on the phone the following Sunday. Michael mentioned the key, the box, the drawer, the trash. And Dan was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mike, do you understand what that means?" "It means I threw away a key. It means you stopped living like the marriage was a case that was still open." Dan's voice was careful, the way it got when he was being serious. "You've been holding that thing open for 3 years, not because you wanted her back, because closing it meant accepting that you'd believed in something that ended. And you—" He paused. "You're not good at accepting that things end, Mike. You're good at surviving them. Different thing." Michael sat at his kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon and held his phone and thought about what Dan had just said. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." "So what changed?" Bang. He looked at the window that faced Claire's house. Her car was in the driveway. Somewhere in there she was working, illustrating something, probably with the focused stillness that was one of her most particular qualities, the ability to be completely still inside her work, the way she was also completely still inside difficult conversations. "Someone showed me the difference," he said, "between surviving and living." Dan made a sound that might have been the closest he came to sentiment. "Good," he said. "Good, Mike." June came in warm and fast, and Emma finished 4th grade with a report card that made Michael stand in the school parking lot reading it twice to make sure he was seeing it right. And when he showed it to Claire that evening, she looked at the remarks from Emma's teacher, perceptive beyond her years, asks the questions other students don't know to ask, and said, "She's going to take over the world," with the specific pride of someone who felt entitled to it, which she had earned and which Michael did not correct. Emma received this assessment with the composure of someone who had suspected as much. The 3 of them drove to the lake that last Friday of the school year. Not a planned thing. It started as a drive and became a stop, and became an afternoon. And Michael sat on the bank watching Emma throw rocks with absolute commitment, while Claire sat next to him with her shoes off and her face turned toward the sun, and he thought, this is what I was afraid I'd never have again. Not the drama, not the fireworks. This. A Friday afternoon at a lake. Someone beside me. My kid throwing rocks. Says. He almost said it out loud. He stopped himself, not from fear, but from the desire to keep it intact for one more minute, the way you held something warm in your hands before setting it down. Die. Then Emma turned around and yelled across the water, Dad, Claire, look at this one. It's perfectly flat. And held up a stone with the reverence of an archaeologist. And Claire cupped her hands around her mouth and yelled back, Hold on to it. That's a keeper. And Michael laughed, full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that came from the place he had thought he'd lost access to. And it echoed over the water, and Emma grinned and threw the stone anyway, just to see it skip. It skipped 7 times. Emma counted out loud. Claire kept the count with her. That was the day Michael stopped waiting for evidence. Not because the fear was completely gone. It would never be completely gone. That was the honest truth of being a person who had loved something and watched it end. But because the evidence had been accumulating for so long, so patiently, so ordinary, that denying it had become the more absurd position. She was here. She kept showing up. She had learned the sound of his house, the rhythm of his daughter, the specific way he went quiet when something was working on him. And she had not left. Then he drove home that evening with Claire in the passenger seat and Emma asleep in the back, her head tilted against the window, one fist still loosely closed around a rock she hadn't thrown, and the summer evening doing something gold with the light. And he reached across and put his hand over Claire's where it rested on the console. She turned her hand over so their palms were together. She didn't look at him. Neither of them said anything. The radio was on low, something old, the kind of song that had no sharp edges. And the road was going by, and Emma was sleeping, and the house was 20 minutes away. He kept his hand there the whole way home. Inside, he carried Emma to her bed without waking her. She had inherited his capacity to sleep through transport, which he considered a gift he'd passed on, and stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. Her room, with its drawings on the wall and its organized chaos of books and craft supplies, the evidence of a person becoming. He had raised her in the aftermath of loss, and she had come out. She was coming out. Perceptive and strong, and capable of arguing about color theory with a woman who knew what she was talking about. He hadn't ruined her. He had been so afraid of ruining her. She was going to be fine, better than fine. He pulled her door halfway closed and walked back to the kitchen where Claire was washing the 2 coffee mugs from the morning, just standing at the sink doing the small domestic thing. And he stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment with the specific quality of feeling that had no other name than, "This is where I want to be." "Hey," he said. She looked over her shoulder. "Hey." He crossed the kitchen. He stood next to her at the sink, and he said, not dramatically, not with preamble, just directly, the way she had always said the important things, the way he was learning to say them. "I love you." She turned off the water. Why? She turned to look at him. Her face was the open, unguarded version, the one she only wore when she thought no one was looking or had decided it was safe to let someone look. And she held his eyes for a long moment with the quality of a person who had been somewhere difficult and found their way out and was not going to diminish the arrival by rushing through it. "I know," she said. Not dismissive, the opposite. The way I know meant, I've known, I've been here, I've been waiting for you to say it because you needed to be the one to say it first. He held her gaze. "You're not going to say it back right now, are you?" "I'm going to say it when I'm ready." She turned back to the mugs. "You'll know." He would know. That was the thing about Claire. Every important thing she said clearly. And when she said it, there was no room to wonder what she meant. He reached past her and dried the mugs while she washed. They worked side by side in the kitchen the way they had worked side by side in the garden. the comfortable labor of two people who had found the right distance from each other, close enough to matter, far enough to breathe. 3 days later, she knocked on his door in the early morning, before Emma was up, before he had his coffee, and when he opened it, she was standing there with her hands in her jacket pockets and her eyes clear and decided. "I love you," she said. "I've known since the night I knocked on your door in January, and you told me the truth about the 10 days. That was the moment. I just needed to be ready to say it." He stood in the doorway in the early morning and felt the word land. Really land. The way things landed when you had been honest about needing them. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She came inside. He made coffee. Emma came downstairs 20 minutes later, assessed the situation with one full sweep of the kitchen, and said, "Finally," with the satisfaction of someone whose long diplomatic effort had borne fruit. Michael looked at Claire. Claire looked at Michael. "Fractions," he said to Emma. "Eat your breakfast." Emma ate her breakfast. She was smiling the whole time and did not try to hide it. That was June. The summer opened out in front of them, ordinary and full. The kind of life that didn't look like anything from the outside but felt, from the inside, like everything. The garden grew. The oak tree dropped leaves on both their sides of the fence, and neither of them minded. Emma learned to draw faces from Claire, who said she had the instincts of someone who had always been watching people carefully, which Emma received as the compliment it was. Michael kept buying the good maple syrup. Claire kept her notes inside books. The coffee was always on by 8 on Saturdays. And the key that had sat in a box for 3 years was gone now, taken out with the Tuesday trash on a regular morning, replaced by 2 ordinary keys on the same hook by the kitchen door. No ceremony, no announcement. Just the quiet, unspectacular, permanent fact of a decision made by 2 people who had both been through enough to understand that love was not the lightning. Love was not the fireworks. Love was the choosing, every morning, every ordinary, unrepeatable morning. Michael Carter had spent 3 years surviving. He had been very good at it. He had held the structure together and kept the lights on and raised his daughter and told himself that fine was enough. He had been wrong about fine. Not because surviving wasn't real. Not because the years alone hadn't made him something harder and more honest than he had been before, but because surviving was the floor, not the ceiling. And the ceiling, the actual, undefended, worth-it ceiling of a life, was this. A woman who had chosen him with her eyes open. A daughter who had negotiated on his behalf with the confidence of someone who knew the outcome before the vote. A garden that was finally growing. A house that had stopped being too quiet. He had been the man people left because he would be fine. He had become, without planning it, without performing it, without even fully seeing it happen, a man someone stayed for. Not because he had fixed the broken parts, not because he had become someone different, but because he had finally, after 3 long years, stopped hiding the parts that were real. And someone had looked at those parts, all of them, the steadiness and the fear and the good maple syrup and the key in the box and the oranges on the wet pavement, and said, "Yes, that one. That is the one I choose." And she had stayed, and that, it turned out, was the whole answer to the question he had been asking himself since a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago when half the closet went empty and the note was on the kitchen table, and he had stood in the fading light not knowing if he would ever stop being the man you left. He was not that man anymore. He was the man Claire Navarro had seen through a fence in November with a bag of groceries and a phone call from his daughter's school, and had walked toward without being asked, and had chosen, deliberately and without apology, every single day since. That was the story, and it was not finished. It was just, finally, truly beginning.